Welcome to the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and if you would like to submit a question for the panelists, please do so in the Q&A panel at any time. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome virtually to Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. I'm Ted Wittenstein, and this is session number 5 of the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, Organizing to Address Cyber Threats. We'll introduce our terrific panelists in just a moment. As a reminder, all attendees have their volume and video muted, but we're eager to incorporate your questions. You can submit those using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And we're recording the session and we'll distribute and post the video afterwards for the benefit of everyone. For those of you tuning in to our forum for the first time, this is the 5th of 7 bi-weekly Thursday webinars taking place this semester, focused on the theme of sovereignty in cyberspace and bridging the divide among the law, technology, policy, business, and academic communities on the most critical cybersecurity challenges. We also have a great group of Yale Law School and Jackson Institute students who are part of the forum for class. You can check out their bios and follow along at cyber.forum.yale.edu. And our 6th session will take place in 2 weeks' time on April 15th, focused on cyber diplomacy. We have former UK Cyber Director Alexander Evans, along with the Deputy Coordinator for Cyber Issues at the US State Department, Michelle Markoff. So Professor Ona Hathaway is our forum director. She's the Bernard and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law, Director of Yale Law School's Center for Global Legal Challenges, a faculty member at the Jackson Institute, and I'm grateful for all her leadership and partnership in putting this all together. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ona to introduce our panel. I'm also going to mute my own volume and video so we can focus on this distinguished lineup. And thanks so much. And over to you, Ona.
Thank you so much, Ted, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you here. Our previous sessions of the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum have focused on internet governance, criminal law enforcement, the role of US Cyber Command and Department of Homeland Security in defending forward, and election interference and disinformation. And our 5th session today is an opportunity to step back for a moment and reflect on the implications of these cyber challenges for organization and strategy across both the public and private sectors. So we're going to be talking today about how should firms organize to best identify and manage cyber risks? What are lessons that we can learn from what we're doing right? And where do we need to improve? When it comes to corporate governance, what are the key questions and decisions that leaders need to consider during cyber crisis response? How should the public sector organize itself to work with the private sector during state-sponsored cyber attacks? What regulatory options seem most promising for stimulating market demand for strengthening cybersecurity? These are just a few of the questions I suspect we'll touch on today. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. We're delighted to have with us to help lead this conversation, David Lashway, who's the co-chair of the Global Cybersecurity Practice at Baker McKenzie. He has been a partner of ours, of the forums, for many years now, and we're so grateful to have him and Baker McKenzie working with us and providing their knowledge and sponsorship of the forum as we continue to build this program. David focuses his practice in the areas of cybersecurity, crisis management, internal investigations, complex criminal, civil, and administrative litigation. He regularly advises Fortune 100 companies on enterprise risks associated with information security, including before, during, and after a network breach. He leads global investigations around theft or compromise of confidential data and trade secrets, including serving as a lead counsel to the cyber investigation firm in the hack of the 2016 US presidential election, which we've discussed in this forum. So we have some amazing panelists with us. If I were to introduce them in the way they deserve, it would take the entire hour. So I'm going to give very brief introductions to each of them. Some of them you probably, students in particular, are already familiar with because we've been reading about many of the events that they've been involved in. So Dmitri Alperovitch is a co-founder and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a nonprofit focused on advancing American prosperity and global leadership in the 21st century and beyond. He is co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike, which we've heard a fair bit about, a leading cybersecurity company. Dmitri is a world-renowned thought leader on cybersecurity strategy and state tradecraft. He served as a special advisor to the Department of Defense, as well as strategic counsel to a wide range of CEOs and board of directors. Peter Beshar is executive vice president and general counsel of Marsh, McLennan, a Fortune 200 professional services firm with 75,000 employees, where he leads the legal, compliance, government relations, risk management, and communications departments. Peter is a recognized leader on cybersecurity with enterprise at the intersection of private enterprise and public policy. And he's testified on these matters before the US Congress and European Parliament. Peter is one of our own. He's a graduate of Yale College and a board member of our own Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Geoff Brown was appointed Chief Information Security Officer for the City of New York in 2016, a position focused on cybersecurity and aggregate information risk across more than 100 city departments and agencies. In July 2017, Mayor de Blasio established the New York City Cyber Command, which Geoff now leads, and it was charged with setting citywide cybersecurity policies, directing the response to cyber incidents, and advising City Hall, agencies, and departments on the city's overall cyber defense. Prior to joining city government, Geoff worked in financial services and also served in the federal government, including working with the 9/11 Commission. And last, and certainly not least, Nicole Lamb-Hale is managing director in the business intelligence and investigations practice of Kroll, a leading security, compliance, and risk management firm, where she leads the firm's CFIUS and national security practices. Prior to joining Kroll, Nicole served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for International Trade Administration, where she served on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, reviewing a wide range of sensitive transactions, including many associated with cyber risk. She's a former deputy counsel of the Commerce Department and recently served on the Council on Foreign Relations Independent Task Force on Innovation and National Security. And I've learned that she's about to become general counsel at Cummins, so we may hear about that as well. So thank you so much, David, for moderating. Thank you, Dmitri, Geoff, Peter, and Nicole for being with us. One brief word, we're going to do the Q&A a little bit differently than we normally do. So normally we save the Q&A for the end. We're going to try an experiment. We're going to try to field these Q&A as they come in. Obviously, we're not going to break in the minute there's a single Q&A, but go ahead and add your questions if you had them. There's a link at the bottom. Go ahead and put your questions in as they occur to you. And we're going to try to take them as we go rather than saving it to the end. So we're going to try to make this more of an organic conversation. So we invite you all to go ahead and put in your questions as they occur to you, and we'll try to turn to them as we go along. All right, thank you so much. And David, over to you.
Thanks so much, Una. And thank you, Ted, for having us today. We're delighted to have this panel, as you mentioned, and then join the Yale Forum again this year. In years past, the conversations have been robust. I think also help guide us as we address some of the increasing risks that we've seen year on year in this space. So a great program, and we're delighted to be here today. You know, as you mentioned, and you could tell from the folks that we've gathered today and some old friends on this panel, it's a little bit different from the other panels, not only this year, but in years past. We've got some of the leading thinkers in this space and folks that deal with this issue in the trenches on a day-to-day basis. Former senior leaders in government, as well as somebody like Peter, who's on the front lines of dealing with the risk manifestation as it actually funnels through the private sector. So we've got a lot of unique perspectives. We have a big panel on purpose because we're talking about a big topic. Normally, a lot of the conversations are very narrowly tailored, although cyber can be a very broad topic generally. But we really focus in many panels, and everyone on this panel has served on hundreds of hours of panels over the last 10 or 15 years individually, some thousands of hours of panels and getting prepared. But today's panel really was to show the myriad of voices and the diversity of ideas that relate specifically to how we're organized, both here in the United States and importantly abroad. So members of our panel today have participated in the Munich conferences, the Davos discussions, the GGE negotiations, trade disputes and trade-related issues, CFIUS evaluations, as we heard from Nicole's background. And they're going to bring all that to bear, we hope, in a series of a couple of very simple questions from Ona and I relating to sort of guiding the conversation today. So the premise again is, are we properly organized? If yes, terrific. Why? If no, what do we need to do better? From a variety of different perspectives, and we'll function around that. We'd also like to start, the main reason why all the folks on this call who have very busy schedules in this space have decided to join today is not only because we've got some other leaders in cyber participating as guests today and listening, but also most importantly, the students. These are the folks that all of us feel very strongly about the future of cybersecurity. Many of the people involved today, and certainly everyone on this panel, have dedicated significant sections of their career to developing others underneath us and above us and around us to ensure that the future is brighter for cyber. We heard yesterday from Ali Mayorkas, an old hand in cyber, back during the Obama administration 1 with Nicole when she was at Commerce, now Secretary of Homeland Security, came out in a talk with RSA, where Dmitri sits on the board, and laid out sort of the priority for the administration. And he made clear again that President Biden has made cybersecurity a top priority. And in his speech, which we would urge you to review, he highlighted some of the key elements of what the president and this new administration is doing with respect to cyber, including obviously the new White House position that will be instantiated in keeping with some of the recommendations in the legislation that occurred. He also prioritized the ability to information share in a more robust manner, which he held out as a key principle during his last tenure when he was Deputy Secretary under Jay Johnson, as well as capacity building. He mentioned the international aspects of this and the importance of cooperation and coordination, and that is a priority as well. We also have observed from the last administration, the Trump administration and the prior Obama administration, a lot of change, not only in the threat landscape, but the way threats have manifested. And Dmitri recently commented about that in Lawfare, which we would urge you to read. We've got the Solarium Commission report and a number of other studies out of other academic institutions and working groups associated with how we can be better organized. So with that backdrop and the vast experience you all have, I'd really like to just start off with one simple question, which is, from your particular vantage point, are we properly organized to address the cyber threats that have manifested today and that we're expecting to manifest in the near and long-term future? So with that question, Dmitri, let's start with you and maybe give us a little bit of a framework from your perspective around whether or not we're properly organized.
I think the answer is quite obviously no, given the sad state of cybersecurity that we're in today. I'm sure no one on this panel, probably in the audience, will disagree with that. The big question is, what is the right answer? And let me give you some of my thoughts on this. The way I think about this is kind of threefold. When you look at the US, and obviously there's a global problem as well that I won't try to address, but within the US, we have the security needs of the federal government and primarily the civilian federal government. We have the security needs of the Department of Defense and our military and really intelligence community networks. And then you have the private sector, which of course is massive and varied. You have critical infrastructure, you have other organizations that we want to try to protect. Here's how I think about this from an organizational perspective. About 10 years ago now, over 10 years ago, we stood up Cyber Command to really have the primary authority to protect the Department of Defense and be responsible for making sure that we can fight through in the cyber domain and provide reliable capabilities to our kinetic force when a conflict arises. I think we're still a long way from making that vision a reality in many ways because the authorities within DoD for security are still very distributed. Unfortunately, in addition to Cyber Command, we still have individual services. They're very much involved in the defense of their own networks. Individual combatant commands are obviously playing a huge role. DISA has still the operational responsibility for many of these networks from a cybersecurity perspective. So you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen and no sort of single throat to choke in many ways that would have the responsibility for the defense of those networks. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have seen such a sad state of affairs on the DoD side with numerous penetrations that we have witnessed from foreign adversaries into those networks. On the civilian side, however, it's even worse. We have not even identified the agency that would have the mission to protect those civilian networks. We have something over 135 different civilian agencies that today are all doing their own thing with different budgets, varying degree of capabilities and teams and talent bases, and totally different technology strategies and cybersecurity standards. That is just not sustainable. And I think we've made some headway when 2 years ago we created CISA, or I guess 3 years ago now, which of course is Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. But until we actually give CISA the authority to do cybersecurity, as opposed to just being an advisor that they are mostly now, they will not live up to that name. So I've long argued that we need to make CISA the CISO, if you will, the Chief Information Security Officer of the federal government, to give them the authority to do what we're trying to do on the DoD side, not yet fully successfully with Cyber Command, but to let CISA run operational security for civilian networks. I think there's a step-by-step process that needs to take place here. By no means is CISA capable today of doing security for the federal government, but over time, I think it can build up that capacity. And from my standpoint, if you sort of don't ever give them that mission, they will certainly never get there. So we need to try. And we're starting to move in that direction. So in the recently passed NDA bill, where a lot of recommendations from the Solarium Commission, the Cyber Solarium Commission, went through, one of the critical ones, in my opinion, was giving CISA the authority to hunt for threats on federal government networks, even if the agencies do not give the permission to do so. I think that's a huge step forward, but beyond hunting, we need to actually provide the ability for them to respond to anything that they detect and to be much more involved in the architectural design and oversight of the cybersecurity programs of all these different agencies. One of the things that CISA is starting to do that I think is terrific under the leadership of the former director, Chris Krebs, is standing up outsourced capabilities like secure email services, secure cloud, and others that agencies can leverage and get directly from CISA, and CISA would be responsible for securing that. I think we need to amplify those types of programs and encourage agencies to really get out of the business that they're not really good at, which is cybersecurity, and focus on what they are good at and what their true mission is in terms of the individual's agency's responsibilities. Just like in the private sector, we don't have every single department within a company doing their own cybersecurity. You know, we don't see marketing department being responsible for cyber or sales or other parts of the organization. We centralize that now within the Chief Information Security Office. We need to do the exact same thing in the federal government. And then the last piece of that is the private sector, and what do you do there? And I think for the most part, the private sector, in my experience, is actually well ahead of much of the federal government in securing its networks. It's uneven. There are organizations that you and I, David, have worked with over the years that are doing extremely well, and there are many others that are not. And to me, the biggest differentiation between these have and have-nots is actually not even the resources. It's not how much money they spend. It's not how big their teams are. It's the authority that the cybersecurity professionals have to be involved in every major decision that the business makes that has an impact on cybersecurity, and being able to stand up and say no in that room. And the organizations that invest enormous power in those organizations and in those individuals are by and large doing exceptionally well, even if they're not spending large amounts of money, because they're able to reduce risk by not making certain decisions or making them differently. And those that don't, doesn't matter whether they spend hundreds of millions of dollars or not, tend to get hacked over and over again. So those are the types of things that we need to encourage from the federal government perspective for the private sector to do. And I think we need to get the boards of directors into this fight. I meet with public boards all the time, and many of them are very concerned about cyber, but they don't know what to do. They're typically not technical. They don't understand cybersecurity issues, but they read the newspapers and they see the impacts the companies suffer on an almost daily basis when these big breaches get revealed. But they don't know how to hold their teams accountable because there's no metrics that we have to determine how good you truly are doing. So they don't understand if they're spending enough, if they're spending on the wrong things, if they're spending too much. They have no way to measure that. And that's why I've always been a fan of speed-based metrics, where you can measure the time to detect, time to investigate, time to remediate on an average basis throughout the quarter or year, and report that to the board so that they know the direction that you're trending in. Is that time increasing? Is it decreasing? And then you can start holding people accountable and demanding results. So I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll discuss.
Dmitri, let me ask you as an opening remark before we turn to the next speaker. Could I also get you to add a fourth category, which is internationally? Obviously, with the GGE meetings, the norms, Chris Painter's job at State Department, the reinstantiation of state's role. We know next week we're going to have some speakers from state participating in the forum. Could I get you to also just comment, are we properly organized at the international level to be addressing what we're seeing today, et cetera? We know this is an area that Ona is particularly focused on in her academic research as well. So it would be helpful to get your insight there.
No, I mean, the international area is a complete disaster. And I'll tell you this, we often talk about how the United States lives in a glass house, and there's no question that we're incredibly vulnerable to cyber attacks. But in all of my travels to numerous countries around the world, I can tell you that we're more prepared on defense than anyone else. That does not mean that we're well prepared. That just is an indication of how much worse the rest of the world literally is in terms of both the strategy and thinking on this issue, certainly the resources and the capabilities. If we think our situation is quite dire, it's even worse outside, including for most of our major allies, which obviously has an impact on our own security. If we are relying on those allies to support us in potential conflict with a great power in the coming decades, that can be pretty challenging if they can be pressured both at home and in terms of their military capabilities to defend themselves. So I don't have good answers there. I mean, solving U.S. cybersecurity issues is challenging enough, but this is something that we certainly should be spending more time thinking about.
Really helpful framework.
I have a couple of quick questions to jump in with from our audience, if you don't mind. I'm gonna take this prerogative, take you all seriously in the invitation. So we got a lot of them. I apologize in advance. There's no way we're going to get to all the great questions the audience is asking, but I still encourage you all to keep them coming. So you can pick or choose which of these you want to answer, Dmitri, because I think they are primarily aimed at you. So one is, what cyber event keeps you awake at night? I thought that was an interesting question. And there was a question here too about how you in particular view the password problem. This is from Omar Karadas, says that he's worked for some significant time working on solving that weak link. Will regulation push the private sector to stop using passwords? Was the question. But so those are a couple of the questions. There's many others, but we'll try to get to more of them as we go.
All right, very, very quickly, just rapid fire. So what cyber event keeps me up at night? It's actually not the cyber Pearl Harbors or cyber 9/11s. I think those analogies are considerably outdated and are not helpful. It's the big challenge with cyber is not that we're going to have some event that triggers the thresholds of us being in a conflict with another nation. It's that it is so effective to be used as an asymmetric tool to pressure us and causes significant pain that doesn't cause that threshold. If a cyber attack takes down our grid, causes numerous people to die, that in some ways is very simple. We know what to do. The aircraft carriers are going to start sailing towards the country that dares to attack us, and we're going to be at war. It's the things that happen that are below that where we struggle with finding a way to respond and deter that type of activity. So what worries me the most is actually that pinprick approach, major ransomware campaign that targets our hospitals in a hugely impactful way or shuts down our schools. Those are not the types of things that you would typically go to war with, and they may be launched not by a nation state, by by some criminal group, but how do you respond clearly when the pain is significant? That's what worries me. In regards to passwords, passwords are a problem, but I'll tell you, there are so many problems in cybersecurity, and it is completely inappropriate to focus on one issue thinking if we can solve that one issue, everything else will fall apart. We need to start changing our mindset to assume breach, assume that any network is not going to be impenetrable, that a capable adversary will always get in, whether through weak password or a known vulnerability that hasn't been patched, or a 0-day, or frankly an insider that's going to get bribed or coerced into a particular action from a nation state or criminal group, as we have seen increasingly over the last few years. So someone is going to get in, and your job is to find them as quickly as possible and get them out before they're able to impart any damage on your network. That's what everyone should be focused on. Building walls is not an effective solution in the physical world, and it certainly is not in cyber.
Thanks, Dmitri. Nicole, we're going to turn to you. So what we heard from Dmitri is that organizationally, we are not properly aligned currently, whether it's our mindset, as he was just stating a moment ago, whether or not within the private sector, our boards actually have the organization, the competency, the capability, and the metrics to measure, whether or not we have the authorities across both the private sector and the public sector to engage properly. So a lot of issues with the way we're organized. What did you see when you were in the government, and what are you seeing today, particularly in the trade areas, CFIUS, or national security controls, where you led the team?
Well, thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to say that I'm in violent agreement with Dmitri on just about everything he said. Dmitri, you took all of my talking points from me. So thank you for that. So what I'd say is, from my time in the Obama administration, I was an assistant secretary in the International Trade Administration. So part of the beauty of that role was that I also sat on CFIUS on behalf of the Commerce Department, and was CFIUS vote for the department, and really got to see the issues, including cybersecurity, that drive those kinds of decisions with CFIUS and Team Telecom and the like. And what I'd say is that one of the challenges that we continue to have is that we're using 20th century tools and approaches to fight 21st century problems and threats. And, one of our largest challenges, and Dmitri spoke to this, is that we're still too decentralized in our approach. There are departments doing various things on their own. We have various agencies that have pockets of authorities. You have the White House that has authorities, and there have been some improvements, and I think Peter is going to talk about that when he speaks, in terms of trying to consolidate. But truly, we have everyone kind of, as my grandmother would say, chickens with their heads cut off. Everybody's running around, no direction that is productive to really fight this threat. Tools like CFIUS and Team Telecom are in some ways blunt instruments. They're really only focused on foreign investment. So that doesn't, think about the fact that, CFIUS and Team Telecom probably touch 10% of transactions, right? They don't, those tools cannot solve this problem. And so what you really have to look at is how do we change it? Well, again, the government needs to consolidate. I like the idea of CISA being, kind of that tip of the spear. There may be other strategies where we can do that so that all of the authorities are consolidated. I'd say that what I've seen since I've been at Kroll is that, one of the issues with the private sector is that, again, there's a lack of expertise in this area, both sometimes at the board and the CEO level. The CISOs don't have the authority that they need often to make quick decisions. And there is I guess I'd like to call it penny wise, pound foolish approach sometimes to not invest in proactive measures. I mean, we see it every day, in an incident response situation. Think about how much money a company has to throw at that. But before that point, there's a reluctance to invest in kind of the capabilities and the monitoring that would be helpful to try to proactively address some of these issues. And so, I loved Dmitri's reference to, this asymmetric war that we're in. I mean, the path forward really from a domestic standpoint, as I mentioned, I think is consolidating the authorities and with the federal government, partnering with the private sector to make sure that those approaches are filtered through the economy as they should be, but also working with our allies, because at the end of the day, this is an asymmetric war between the U.S. and its allies and others who, don't have the power to, or maybe not the appetite to engage in a war, a physical war, but can really wreak havoc in this context in the cyberspace. So,
Nicole, let me ask you a question about that. So one of the things that I think we observed in a number of the projects we've worked on together, whether it was nation state against nation state, Chinese espionage, national security related matters, or even the massive investigation that you ran with one nation state's largest company engaging in espionage here in the United States, is, you talked a lot and talked to their board when I was there with you, members of our team, around these constructs of, organization requires some degree of cooperation, a measurable amount of cooperation. And I think what you pointed out so far in your comments, and Dmitri's comments reflected this as well, is that we probably don't have the degree of cooperation necessary to properly organize. Assuming that you're right, that this is cooperative game theory, which I've heard you talk about before, and the elements of that. I mean, what are your observations now? Is it that we just don't have the degree of cooperation necessary to properly organize internationally, and we're using these blunt instruments, as you call them, to try to counter that? Because that doesn't increase cooperation. The blunt instrument would seem to prevent further cooperation. I wonder if you would comment.
I absolutely agree. I mean, there are definitely efforts that are underway to create some synergies around the approaches that the U.S. and our allies use to fight these threats. But, there are all kinds of impediments to that. We have differences in privacy regulations, for instance. I mean, there are a lot of things that, the differences swallow up the commonalities, it seems, often in these, in kind of the approaches with our allies. And so, I think that is an issue. I think that more coordination in terms of who the common, where the common threats are, like the identification of the common threats would be helpful. There are tensions there because, as we know, there are certain nation states who have outsized economic power. And so our companies are often kind of, stretched. They understand what the threat is, but they also have customers, that they're in those countries. And so there are a lot of tensions. And so what we've got to try to do is, kind of lead from the front in terms of providing some shield, a bit of a shield. And if we're coordinated, there's a better shield for our companies and our industry as they fight these asymmetric threats than if we don't. And that's the challenge. And the question is, from a diplomatic standpoint, how do you get there? And that deserves quite a bit of attention. And again, from the standpoint of the federal government, having a unified approach that is not scattered among agencies, various agencies and authorities, would be helpful in that regard.
I have a question from a student that's maybe a good follow-on to that. So Lauren Leskay, a student who's enrolled in the law school class, asked about a proposal that was advocated by former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, that Congress should give NSA additional authority to conduct cyber defense domestically in response to solar winds. I wonder if you have thoughts about that and whether that's appropriate. I mean, you've rightly raised the fact that there's all these different agencies who are involved in this, and sort of giving additional authority to one agency to hunt for these problems domestically. Is that the right response to solar winds, or should we be thinking about it differently?
Well, I think to the points that have been made earlier, consolidation is important, because if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing or is doing something different altogether, I don't think the solutions that we need will result. How that looks and how that's structured, I'm sure will be a matter of great debate, but we do need to really update and consolidate these authorities. Because I can tell you, I mean, I was in the Obama administration in 2010. We were having discussions about the fact that we're too decentralized. No one has ultimate authority here. And then, the problems have only escalated since then. I mean, those were the good old days almost in the cyber world. But I think that at the end of the day, consolidation on the federal government level, and an effort to work with the private sector, recognizing some of the stressors and pressures that they're under dealing with certain nation states is going to be the key forward.
Thanks, Nicole. I mean, clearly, as you pointed out, you got business on the front line of this conflict, and the way we're currently organized appears to be challenged from your perspective. Geoff, over to you for following up on Dmitri's point about the 135 distributed power federal agencies, let alone within DoD, as he pointed out, the framework there. You're looking at this from your prior experience, similar to others on the phone, from your federal government experience, private sector experience, and now for the last several years being charged with standing up a defensive posture for the entire city of New York. As Dmitri pointed out, some of the things that keep him up at night, and Nicole agreed with this, major healthcare attacks, school attacks. You're overseeing the security for the largest school district in America, the largest public water system in America, the largest trash system in America, the largest transportation system in America. I could go on and on. You have a broad set of shoulders and obviously a major challenge. I wonder if you would comment around the way you're seeing things about our organization and frankly, whether or not your assessment of whether or not we were properly organized led to Cyber Command in the first instance.
So thank you for that sort of question, David. I just want to say before my remarks, I really do appreciate the invitation to join the forum today. Thank you very much for that to Yale and to the students, especially since this is about you. To the question about whether or not we're organized, certainly I think I agree with my co-panelists. I don't think we're organized today, but I think we have the potential to do so. I really do. And maybe I can talk via example a little bit about, to your point, what we've done in New York City. What really is the purpose of New York City Cyber Command? Why did the mayor sign that executive order? Why did City Council follow up with additional legislation? The purpose is very much what we've been hearing about today. It's a unification of cybersecurity, the authority to act, and the governance model within the city. If you think about the apparatus, and you mentioned some of the great organizations that provide services each and every day to New Yorkers in the city, if you think about that apparatus has to be defended because it delivers its services through technology each and every day. What we recognized was that the city needed to have one organization that had a governance model that could create an umbrella of strategy. That strategy isn't an independent thing. In many ways, the strategy, the implementation of various technical and administrative controls is done through our agencies. We lead the way, and they do an incredible amount of work in partnership with us. But there are some very important pieces that we've consolidated. You've heard a little bit about some of the recommendations today, and we've done some of these things in New York City. For instance, we do have visibility and actionability across that large corpus of technology. So when you hear about a federated model, whether it be an enterprise or in the government, in New York City, a decision was made that we needed to do threat management through one apparatus, so we could hunt those networks. If something starts to go wrong, we can lead the incident response, and importantly, try and get in front of the speed of the adversary. We cannot do that, however, without the full support of City Hall. So we needed to have the full support of City Hall. We needed to have the full support of the mayor. And as an organization, we needed to work through that support very carefully and diplomatically with our agency partners. Now, there's an additional element because New York City isn't just the New York City government. New York City government is there to serve New Yorkers. And that means residents and visitors and businesses and the whole society that is the great city of New York. So when we think about building more resiliency, our vision is for New York City to be a cyber resilient city. And of course, everyone on this call, and everyone listening hears a lot about resiliency in cybersecurity conversations. But that resiliency not only is the technology, not only is the security strategy, but it goes beyond that. It goes to all the participants that make New York City function. And we really think about New York City being a cyber resilient city by having a more resilient sort of cooperation in our private and our public sector partnerships. How did we go about that? Well, we launched something called Cyber Critical Services and Infrastructure. And that, through 4 co-founders, New York City Cyber Command, the New York City Police Department, but the Manhattan DA, and the Global Cyber Alliance, this partnership came together and invited cross disciplines, cross sectors, cross vertical participants across New York City to a single table and said, one impact of a significant cyber effect could impact us all. It could be the financial services industry, which is critical and has great leadership in cybersecurity. It could be the water utility. It could be our sanitation services. It could be media and entertainment. It could be transportation. It could be energy. It could be telecommunications. It could be any of these sectors. All of them, if impacted, a New Yorker will care. So where New Yorkers care, we go, right? And to a certain extent, that effort, this cyber critical services and infrastructure, is it finished? Is it perfect? No, it's a journey, but at least we've practiced together. We've gotten together. We know each other, and we know if there's an impact to one, it means an impact to all, and we have to react to the benefit of New Yorkers together.
Geoff, yesterday's speech by Ali, he indicated that to advance the federal government's ability to be properly organized to address cyber-related issues going forward, the kind that Dmitri was highlighting, that there's going to be nearly a dozen actions that are going to be identified in an upcoming executive order coming out of the new administration. And I quote, "The U.S. government will improve in the areas of detection, information sharing, modernizing federal cybersecurity, federal procurement, and federal incident response." Dmitri, if we can get you to comment first and then back to Geoff, those 4 or 5 pillars of what is a shaping executive order that many of us are involved in, is that the recipe we're seeing in New York City, Geoff? And Dmitri, I know that you were also involved in cooperating with the team in New York and Geoff's team to help build that organizational model. What are your thoughts there? Are those the key pillars, Dmitri?
Well, the executive order in some ways is incredibly detailed. It may be the most detailed executive order, certainly on cyber, that a president is ever going to put out. And it has a long list of things that federal government agencies should do, CISA should be doing, responsibilities for government contractors, all I think very, very positive to move the ball forward. But I don't think there's sort of one thing that is more important than the others. A lot of cyber response really is about sort of eating your healthy breakfast in the morning and doing the right things. And it's not necessarily the big sexy things that people like to latch onto and think that that's going to solve all their problems.
Geoff, back to you. Obviously, as Dmitri's pointing out, there's a recipe and there's a chef. It's obviously the recipe is not going to serve everything, but are these the elements that you were focused on? Are there additional elements on how we're currently organized in New York? It seems, I think, to a lot of us that New York and what you've done in New York is by far leading, forward-leaning, much further advanced than any other municipality in the world, and certainly even what the federal government desires, the ability to hunt across networks being one example. So what are your thoughts there?
I think to a certain extent, we have had the opportunity to lead in New York, but that's because we have such a sacred trust with New Yorkers. Now, yes, we have taken measure to unify the governance through policy and standard, through reporting structure directly to City Hall, and then through coordination where the agencies themselves have, technical teams and security teams. We've done some of those things. We've also, as I noted, built out the capability, and we will continue to build out the capability to see what's going on across the city networks and to take action. And that's not necessarily always action, meaning an analyst has to spend time and send emails and do a bunch of stuff. A lot of times, the most effective action is automated action, decisions that things are not acceptable on the network and need to be blocked at machine speed. Being able to do that across the commonality of the full technical footprint is incredibly important, and that allows you, in fact, to Dmitri's point, to take care of perhaps some of the routine of staying healthy in this space. But I would also highlight it's not always just about, and I think perhaps my co-panelists who are involved in enterprise cyber defense might think about and agree with this perhaps. It's not always about what you're doing to protect your enterprise interests. It's also what you're doing to help your, so to speak, customers and clients and consumers. In New York City, to us, that's New Yorkers. So though imperfect, we did make a decision, perhaps the tactics are imperfect right now, but we did make a decision that we needed to bring cybersecurity to New Yorkers themselves in ways that respect their values. And we call that the NYC Secure Initiative. We launched some technical tactics to help New Yorkers themselves make decisions to stay away from the threats they may encounter as they conduct their internet lives, things like the NYC Secure app. And we've taken our own measures themselves, working with non-for-profits like the Global Cyber Alliance and Quad 9, to make sure that if you are a New Yorker and you want to go to an establishment where the city is providing free public Wi-Fi, because we think that's important, bridging that digital divide for New Yorkers. So where New Yorkers go to access free public Wi-Fi, we've put a DNS security solution that doesn't collect their private data. Nothing in the NYC Secure Initiative collects private data.
Yeah, does that increase your efficacy? That if you do this in a way, and what you're suggesting is along the lines of what Dmitri was talking about the mindset, if we do this in a way that's more culturally assimilative, does that increase efficacy? Are you finding that in New York? Across 9 million New Yorkers?
Well, I think to a certain extent, globally, because this is a bit about bridging the divide, and we have to recognize that there's other jurisdictions, other sovereignties, other places where the government contract with the citizens they serve might be different. But in New York, we certainly realize that New Yorkers have a value set, and we're going to respect that value set. And because of that, we think there has been good efficacy of the solution set across the base. And certainly that's in our public-facing initiative. And as an enterprise, we think there's been great efficacy in the effectiveness of our technical capability to prevent and respond.
I've got a couple of questions here that I might jump in with. So Stuart Halpern, who may have been a classmate of yours, Peter, says, so much of our vulnerability is at the local government level, for example, local water districts. Does cybersecurity for critical local infrastructure need to be nationalized, or how else can local infrastructure be adequately secured? And I'd just add to that, like what you're doing is really extraordinary, but not every city has the resources of a New York City, and so may not be able to do all of the things that you're doing. So should we think about whether there's appropriate role for the national government? I don't know if nationalizing infrastructure is the answer, but how do you address that? And then a broader question that you've already touched on, but I'll just mention it, from another attendee who asked how you see public and private sector collaboration playing a role for New York's long-term cybersecurity strategy. So that's a lot.
Happy just to jump in on both questions. Certainly, I'll go in reverse order. For private-public partnerships, that's the term we use here in the industry, it's absolutely essential. Because the reality, I talked a little bit about building a resilient New York, resilient society. The reality is there are additional measures that can be brought to bear when you need to respond. And we see that when we think about the participation in cities and how they responded to the pandemic. It isn't just one organization with one capability that helps the citizen. It is the hatching together, perhaps, either through careful planning or in a time of need, of multiple capabilities, of multiple folks. Perhaps in the kitchen analogy, you need not just a chef, a head chef, but you need everybody else there to make the restaurant run, make it successful. And I think you see that, but being able to have public and private partnerships like New York City's cybercritical services and infrastructure to convene those places to practice together, you'll do better off when the impact comes. And to the second question around the critical infrastructure, this is an absolutely important topic. We've seen an incredible amount of attention to it in the federal space and certainly in the cybersecurity industry. Do I think that other municipalities can do what New York City has done? In the short term, of course, it's very challenging. We have a great resources in the city to address the things that New Yorkers need us to address. But I think the model, though, is kind of interesting, because when you think about creating an umbrella commonality of information sharing and actionability, cities have an opportunity that's different than sometimes in the private sector, because municipalities don't have to compete with each other. And therein, we may be able to more effectively say, hey, this is how we're doing it, and share. This is how we're doing it. This is what worked for us. How can we create sort of teaming agreements that allow for cities themselves, in cooperation with the federal government, to expand at a much greater pace in, the unification of our defenses.
Yeah, there's an antitrust paper in there for some student relating to some of the controls and whether or not we're properly organized. So thank you for that, Geoff. That's a really insightful comment. Peter, we're gonna take that and turn to you. We've heard a lot from the other speakers today about what's working and what's not working. And as going back to what Dmitri started us off with, the way we're currently aligned and some of our mindset issues really need to be re-examined. Whether it's the NIST standard with prevent, detect, respond, that type of framework. I mean, Dmitri's proffering today, again, as he has so many times in so many fora, that framework works maybe on a targeted, simple cybersecurity responsive type posture. But this is a much larger national security issue. And as Nicole pointed out, many of the national security issues, as they have manifested, are being met with blunt instruments or limited control and authority capabilities. As Geoff has indicated, as a city, obviously he's under attack every day. And under our current definitional schemes, that constitutes an active armed conflict in many situations, as the students and Una and Ted students know very well, that critical infrastructure in the city of New York under attack can constitute an active armed conflict and then trigger those types of responses that are proportionate under our current organizational framework. You're at the front lines of dealing with this in a very unique way, in an important way, and not the traditional insurance way. Many years ago, those of us on this panel recall our former director of the NSA saying that a lot of this on the commercial side can be dealt with through the complex contracting in the insurance markets. And that can be a good answer for us. At the same time, we were saying that we've got over $300 billion in intellectual property that's leaving our shores, and the largest transfer of wealth in history. And that has only evolved, as we heard on this call and in every cyber conference and meeting that you hear. You're the guy who ends up paying for it and then distributing that in many respects, and dealing with those who are contractually obligated. And so my question for you really is, in light of the comments today and your experience, is the private contracting model that we're using and that we're currently organized around to absorb or seek to absorb at least a substantial portion, if not any portion, of cyber-related manifest risk working? In PCI DSS with credit cards, the payment processor hacks and the bank heists relating to that, those have been fairly efficient. We've got a lot of litigation and other things and externalities resulting. But ultimately, the private parties, the acquiring banks, the issuing banks, the payment processors, the merchants, they've worked out a way to deal with this. And they're enhancing their cybersecurity through the brilliant work of guys like Dmitri and others to develop technology and enhance their capabilities to respond more efficiently and effectively. Is it working in your space?
Great, thank you for that, David, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to have the chance to speak to the Yale community today. First and foremost, to the students, we are so hoping that you're going to do a better job on this than all the fancy panelists here have done to this point. And what an incredible field to commit your energies to. It's going to impact every single aspect of public and private life in the years ahead, and particularly as new innovations like AI and quantum computing come into the mix. And also to the Yale faculty, I want to say, just please be a little nicer to people in the business world. Academic can sometimes make it sound so straightforward and easy what people in industry are supposed to be doing. And I'm here to share that it's quite hard on the front lines, that we are really being buffeted by two new vectors of attack, the supply chain concept that was so powerfully demonstrated in SolarWinds, but also just ransomware attacks that are growing in severity and frequency. And these forms of attack are not going up 20% or 30%. They're going up 200% and 300%. And really the consequences are just so much more dire. If you look at the SolarWinds attack, I'm struck at how little consensus there truly is about what it is that we should be doing in the wake of it. What's the business response? What's the government response fundamentally to a Trojan horse type of attack of this scale and magnitude? There's been a lot of talk about public-private partnership, and it's just so fundamental in this arena. There are many analogies to the fight against terrorism, and then there are really some important differences to it. One key difference in the terrorism context, probably 95% of the relevant information is in the hands of the government. Industry has a piece that it can do to contribute, but it is by no means the driver. In the cyber realm, it really is different, as Ann Neuberger has recognized that public-private partnerships with the notion that 80% of critical infrastructure is owned or operated by the private sector in the United States, that dynamic is so changed. And I don't think we have really grappled with that reality. With the current construct between government and industry, there's lots of good faith attempts, but you haven't really seen the White House be mobilized in a way to try to leverage industry, summon all the CEOs, not just of the tech companies, but of mainstream corporations, to say that you have been principally focused on protecting your own skin, but there's a higher calling here that we are asking you to contribute to really try to advance the collective cyber resilience of our critical infrastructure and our country, candidly. David, I'm happy to stop there. If you want me to briefly address the kind of economic incentives around insurance, I'm happy to go there or do that later.
Well, first, I think on the organizational principle of just generally the absence or the lack of adequate altruism is a very important observation as to how we're currently organized. As you know, your co-panelists are some of the most altruistic people in this space, which is frankly why they're on our panel today. And I think your observation there is incredibly important, and there's paper after paper that can be written on that topic. Would you please just very quickly for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to turn to the last 15 minutes of how do we fix this, highlight how you're seeing the organization, the economic organization, and the pass-through modeling in the private sector. Is that sufficient? Is it working? Ransomware demands are going up. The model is becoming even more instantiated where the incentives are misaligned. I think as Dmitri said, one of his fears, one of his two, was increased ransomware. Most of us have lines under our eyes because we've been dealing with dozens, if not hundreds of these attacks over the course of the last year, let alone last several years. And the flagging attack that Dmitri mentioned in his Lawfare article, the NotPetya destructive attack, which looked like ransomware at the beginning. So Peter, just a couple more minutes on that. That would be helpful.
Sure. A good place to start is Benjamin Franklin, if you can believe it. This man was the most extraordinary forward thinker, innovator. So he's really considered the father of insurance in the United States. He set up something called the Philadelphia Contributorship in the 1790s. And the concept is that just anybody couldn't get access to insurance. That what insurance could do was to establish a set of best practices. And only if you adhered to those best practices could you actually subscribe to the Philadelphia Contributorship and be a policyholder. So the big peril in those days was naturally fire. Fires would burn from wooden house to wooden house. The sidewalks were wooden. And so he set up a whole set of defensive measures. You had to have something escaping from your roof to be able to access your roof to put out embers if they happen to jump from house to house. And if you did these things, you could subscribe and you would get a silver mark on your house. So the voluntary fire brigade, which Franklin also introduced, would come to your house and actually give you protection. And when you talk about insurance, if all you're doing is passing risk and the responsibility to pay from one party to another, it's not very compelling. from a policy perspective, you're not really advancing the cause. So the question is whether insurance can be a driver of behavioral change, because that's what we need. That's what Dmitri and the others are talking about. You have to drive differences in the way that actors, thousands of actors, are conducting themselves. And there we really believe that insurance can create that economic benefit, that if your current practices are here, but you follow this set of better practices, best practices, then you can enhance your cyber resilience and you will be benefited economically by the fact that you have done that. Within the specific realm of ransomware, everybody has a simple policy. I don't want to pay, I'm not going to pay. Unfortunately, what you're finding now is the attacks are becoming so disabling that more and more companies are paying. And I applaud folks like Treasury trying to promulgate regulations that urge people not to pay, because who is it after all that you're actually providing the Bitcoin payments to? But that is something that really is a conundrum for society right now. There are measures like backups. If you have a sound system of backups, then your ability to at least resist and be coerced into paying ransom is that much better. So to try to invest in a sound system, what is Yale University's system? There are lots of different methodologies for backups, but those are some of the drivers that we would look at.
That's a great point. And, obviously there's a lot to look at there, and whether or not, the compute space for backup ought to be priced the same as the front space, the prod environment, and how you could actually create those types of incentives, as well as from a federal program and tax changes. You've raised a lot of very substantial questions there, and that's really helpful here. A lot to chew on. Thank you all. I think we've laid out the problem set for the last 45 minutes or so fairly well. It's a dire situation. It's a dire view, as we all know. You've all highlighted from the mindset all the way to the very tactical at the system level some of the challenges we're confronting in our current organizational model. I would like to turn quickly then to what do we do? Are there near-term and longer-term approaches or pillars or domains that we should be considering now that would be essential? We've got some in Solarium, we've got some in the statements coming out of the White House. Clearly the executive order, as Dmitri highlighted, is going to be fairly clear and directive, and maybe even prescriptive within the federal government agencies. But what are the key pillars to better organize ourselves using the framework we started with at the private sector level, at the public sector level, and at the international level? So Dmitri, we'll start with you. If you could kick us off with that same maybe 3 or 4 tier model that you laid out at the beginning. How do we do better?
Well, I'll actually quote from my recent testimony. I testified in front of the House Homeland Security Committee about a month and a half ago. And I gave them 5 recommendations specifically that we can implement in legislation in the very near future to actually move the ball forward quite significantly. One I've already talked about: let's make CISA the CISO, the federal civilian government. Again, do that in a step-by-step process where you can incentivize federal government agencies to turn over their cybersecurity programs to CISA. In fact, making CISA sort of the outsourced managed security provider, if you will, for those agencies. We can create all kinds of incentives for why they would want to do that. Right now, as you know, David, those agencies face pretty onerous compliance obligations under the FISMA legislation. Agencies hate them. The FISMA scores that come out every year are a big black eye for the heads of those agencies. So imagine if we had a legislation that says, if you outsource your cybersecurity to CISA, you as an agency no longer have to do FISMA compliance. CISA can take care of that. Any bad scores will be reflective on them, not you. I think that can be an incredibly powerful incentive to start to get those agencies to sort of shed their cybersecurity obligations and turn it over to CISA. So that's number one. Number two,
Dmitri, before you leave number one, just if I may, one of the things that you mentioned there, I think that would require just 30 seconds more of comment. One of the things that, since you gave that testimony, that I've heard a lot about, and I know others on this call have heard a lot about, is within that, you're also advocating for something that you also pointed out at the beginning, sort of a consolidation and better metrics. So when you do that consolidation of that CISO type role, it's not just the authority grant, it's the prescriptive requirements pursuant to it that Geoff has established in New York, for example. Could you just give us 30 more seconds on?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're not
it actually
suggesting to put it in CISA, you're suggesting a lot more than that.
Yeah, on the metric side, that was actually my second recommendation, which is that we need to start measuring agencies' response to cyber threats using speed-based metrics. The way we win in cyber is speed. You know, it's the same way that we win kinetically. That OODA loop concept from John Boyd back in the 60s and 70s that really revolutionized air warfare and how we do combat in general. We need to apply the same approach to cyber. We need to be faster than the adversaries, and the ones I specifically like are the ones I mentioned: time to detect, time to investigate, time to remediate. If you measure that on a consistent basis, if you mandate that those metrics be driven to their most minimal possible values, quarter over quarter, year over year, that's how we win. That's how we achieve much greater resiliency. And I think that's how we need to start demanding that agencies report those metrics to CISA, to OMB, to relevant congressional oversight committees. And then when they consistently fail on those metrics, that's when we can use sort of the power of Congress to say, you know, you failed 3 times here, Agency X, you will no longer be responsible for cyber. We're giving that authority to CISA, so that can be another powerful way to cause change here. Another one is a comprehensive breach notification law. This is something that I think actually will happen this year. Post SolarWinds, there's an incredible amount of interest on the Hill on both sides and in Senate and House to get this done. They all realize that if Kevin Mandia, our good friend, hadn't done the very courageous thing last December and come forward, actually overruling his lawyers and reported the breach that ultimately we all came to know as SolarWinds, or as I call it, the Holiday Bay operation, because it actually is much broader than just SolarWinds. We perhaps even to this day would not know that this had occurred. So I think we need a federal law that does a couple of things. One, preempts state laws. Obviously, we need to do that, where, you know, reporting to 50 state attorney generals is unpalatable, and companies hate that. But 2, perhaps even more importantly, change the thresholds for reporting. Today, David, as you know super well, the thresholds are really about the impact to the organization and was there, you know, PI information that was exposed. I think that's completely the wrong standard. Frankly, that type of reporting does no one any good. You know, why does average consumer care that their information was compromised in their Marriott breach, as an example, or any one of those other breaches that we've seen over the years? At this point, it actually has no effect whatsoever on their life. But it would be important to actually understand the details of what is happening inside of those organizations from a threat perspective, so we can start aggregating that information and looking for trends and helping all of us improve our collective defenses. So focusing it more on sharing the threat information as opposed to the details of the breach is where we need to get to. And the other 2 I'll briefly mention. On the ransomware piece, the way to solve ransomware is actually not to focus on ransomware. It's to focus on cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is sort of the oxygen that fuels the fire of ransomware. It's no mistake that, no accident that I should say that ransomware only became a major problem about 10 years ago when Bitcoin emerged as an anonymous way to do payments. If we actually decloak the anonymity of cryptocurrency, that will have a huge effect on a lot of these ransomware actors and, frankly, other people that are using cryptocurrency for illicit use. So the Treasury Department in December issued a proposed regulation to do KYC, know your customer rules, for cryptocurrency payment systems. We need to make sure that happens. And I think that would have a massive effect on the entire ransomware ecosystem. And last one, which I think will actually be addressed in large part in the executive order, is we need to change procurement standards in the federal government for critical sort of high-risk software like SolarWinds, frankly, and many others that are used at high levels of privileges within government networks. We need much higher standards for it and start demanding transparency from those vendors. So those are my 5.
Yeah, that's great. So we've got some transparency changes, some additional authority changes, a number of different recommendations in there that flow through each of those potential policy proposals. Peter, over to you. What will make us better here, both in the near long term and the longer long term? And comment on any that Dmitri mentioned as well.
Dmitri's focused most of his remarks on the government, what should be going on in the public sector. From my vantage point in the private sector, we need to have a response to solar winds. There has to be some change in the process for building, designing, and distributing software. Large companies rely upon hundreds, if not thousands, of software vendors. And for sure, companies should be trying to reduce that volume of vendors. But at the same time, what's left is too large of a universe for us to be able to credibly try to pierce into that development process. So I really think it's incumbent upon industry, particularly the software development industry, to try to have the leaders come together and say, we need to create voluntary protocols that will establish more rigorous security details. Concepts like you can't modify code unless you have a physical token. There's going to be detailed logging at every stage of the process, and quite possibly that process will then be audited by a third party.
Interesting. So you're looking more toward voluntary industry-based standards that would be market-based as opposed to more prescriptive or performance-based regulatory models through administrative law along the lines.
I do, from a business perspective, where you can create voluntary measures that industry is motivated to go make these types of changes. It'll happen faster and perhaps a more durable solution. And if that doesn't work, then you go the regulatory route. Thanks, Peter.
Nicole, to you. And please, if you would, at least spend a moment or so on the international. I think you and others really focused on some of the failure scenarios that we've experienced through the international regime, our current structure and our current organizations. What can we doing better? What can we be doing better at the international level, and even our domestic tools and realigning those to reach international goals?
Well, I think it's going to be important for us to align properly on the domestic level in order to have impact with our allies. And in one area that I think is important, as I mentioned before, is the partnering with the private sector, as Peter said. It's not just a government play, it's the private sector has to be involved. The government needs to understand what the private sector is facing as it does business around the world. Where are the stressors, where are the inconsistencies from a policy standpoint that affect their business, right? That both from a, kind of a cybersecurity perspective and a cost perspective with various regulations, around the world that drive cost, increase costs for global companies. I think it will be very important too, that these issues be fed into the trade agreement development, U.S. trade agreements of any stripe with our allies and with those that we may have strategic alliances with from time to time, to ensure that some of these principles are embedded into those agreements. And while imperfect, if there is some kind of a breach that is involving us, nation states, we have a cohesive and coherent approach to address them. And I could see this really happening, when you look at TPP, which, unfortunately we stepped away from. TPP was less of a trade agreement and more of a kind of a policy statement on how we're going to handle things like, breaches of intellectual property and the like. And so when you have multi-country regional trade agreements that have this kind of information and these approaches embedded, I think it gives, like-minded countries more power to address some of these issues than we have today. So I think that would be a huge move, and it's going to require, some people with technical expertise to be involved in order to make it work.
And some American leadership.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Nicole. Really hugely insightful. Geoff, we're going to ask you to wrap us up. A couple years ago, when we were doing this conference over dinner, speakers dinner, Mr. Kissinger was talking with us and those of us who were gathered, and he said that, you know, in many respects, what we had to do for nuclear was easier than cyber, because what we figured out was, to Dmitri's point about the metrics, is that we could measure the megatons, figure out the blast radius, calculate what we had and what they had, and we could play the game according to those basic rules. In cyber, the way it's been described today and so many times over, that analogy doesn't hold. And as Mr. Kissinger said that evening, that not only makes for a very complicated game, but it makes for complicated players. And as a result of that comment, you know, a lot of us have talked about that comment, I know, over many dinners since then. What are your thoughts about how we're organized and what we need to do better for cities like New York? These are the most important policies on the planet. Your obligations are enormous. You've got great partners. You're setting up authorities. You're doing many of the things that Dmitri described. But we got a long way to go. When you're, as John Woods likes to say, sort of at the front line of the conflict, what do you do?
I think you have to recognize, to your analogy, that there's many different players, but what you have to recognize is they are all fantastic players. So what I would want to do in closing is offer some hope, especially to the students who will join the field one day. So we have fantastic players. We really do. We have the best of the best at our capability. But to the theme of today's conversation, we need to organize better. We need to learn how to pass the ball better. We can't all be the star player vying for the VIP trophy at the end of the season. This is a winning team. It really is. This is a winning team. It really is. The only thing is, we have to organize. We got to practice together. We got to learn to pass the ball. We can't all want to be the VIP. We have to listen to the coach. We have to recognize that everybody in the stands, in the owner's box, those are the American people. That's who we're playing for. That's who's cheering for us. That should be motivating. But to go back to my comment, we can have some hope. It's an incredible team. And, you know, in closing, I just want to thank the students who have intent to join the field.
Thanks a lot for that inspiring remark, Geoff. You know, obviously, big challenges ahead, but also with the altruism, with a change of mindset, some of the techniques that Dmitri's laid out, with a new focus on our partners internationally, Nicole, clearly with the leadership that academia and the rigor of their analysis that Una and Ted and others are bringing, and the work that you're doing on the front lines on behalf of, you know, how we're currently organized within our nation state at the city level. There are things to be hopeful for. Thank you again, Yale. Thank you for joining us. Una, back over to you. And we hope this has been helpful.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all. We could go on all afternoon easily and still not even scratch the surface, but we've managed to delve into a large number of issues, and we're so grateful to all of you. Many of the points that were raised, Peter, you know, your point that one of the concerns is that public and private don't speak to one another very often. We don't often, particularly in academia, think that much about the role that the private sector plays in cybersecurity. And one of the reasons we started this whole initiative was precisely to try and address that gap in the conversation and try and bring people like you into the university, into the conversation, to the students and to all of us, so that we can get a broader and deeper understanding of these issues. And you all have really contributed a lot to our understanding. So thank you so much for that. Ted, I'll let you close us out, but thank you guys so much for this great conversation. And thanks to all our wonderful attendees.
And let me just, before we turn to Ted, just say thank you again to the panelists. Each of you oftentimes is a keynote in these types of fora, where you're interviewed or you spend time speaking to large audiences, sometimes thousands of people gathered. It's rare to have you as panelists within a larger panel discussion like this. We very much appreciate your time and your willingness to join a panel like this, recognizing that most of the time you could certainly on your own, and you often do, fill up the entire panel. So we appreciate the richness of the dialogue and what each of you brought. Thank you again.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much. Be well, everyone. We will share the recording of this with everyone. And it was a tour de force. I enjoyed, for once, being out on the scenes and taking copious notes. So this is terrific. And we're just grateful to everyone for your time. So be well and take care.
Bula bula.
Take care.